We need to restore discipline, save more, spend less. I want to talk about the deeper causes that we don't talk about enough, because these are really not economic issues. These are really philosophical issues. The real cause of our economic problems are a combination of altruism and pragmatism. Where did affordable housing come from? Where does free health care come from? Everybody has a right to a house. Provided by who? Everybody has a right to health care. Provided by who? That is an inversion of the American concept of rights. Under the American concept of rights, under the Founding Fathers' idea, each of us has a moral right to what we produce. We do not have a right to what anybody else produces. Your right to free medical care is your right to enslave a doctor to provide that, or enslave somebody to pay that doctor. That is an inversion of the American idea of rights. And what it leads to is a redistribution from the productive to the non-productive. And it basically says that no one has a right to their own life. Everybody's a slave to everybody else. And then you combine that with pragmatism, which is what we talk a lot about in business. Do what works. Here's the dilemma with what works. A lot of things work in the short term that are very destructive in the long term. Negative amortization mortgages work for years, very destructive in the long term. Interestingly enough, it's not surprising that the people end up acting irrationally, because rationality requires long-term perspective. You can't do what works and be rational in the long term. Also, it's not surprising people don't have integrity. Integrity demands a long-term perspective. Combine altruism with pragmatism, and you get a free lunch mentality. Free lunch mentality. Look at Social Security and Medicare. Neither candidate promised to do anything seriously about Social Security and Medicare. And if they had of, they wouldn't have been elected, right? And the free lunch mentality leads to a lack of personal responsibility. And that is the death of democracies. That is the death of democracy. The Founding Fathers talked about the tyranny of the majority. They really were talking about the abuse of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. But they also realized that when 51% of the people figure out they can get a free lunch from 49%, then pretty soon 60% want a free lunch from 40, and then 70% want a free lunch from 30, and then the 30 quit, and the democracy fails. The United States was founded on exactly the opposite ideas. And these are the cure. The cure is the philosophical ideas that made America great in the first place. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each individual's moral right to their personal lives, to the product of their labor. They're right to give it away if they choose to, but it's their right, not the government's right. Each individual's moral right to their own life. Interestingly enough, that demands personal responsibility, because there are no free lunches. There are no free lunches. It also, interestingly enough, demands and rewards rationality and self-discipline. The United States was the only country ever created under the idea that people should act in their rational long-term interests properly understood, in the Aristotelian sense of the word, of a life well lived. In the context of what I call the trader principle. And the trader principle is that you don't take advantage of other people, because pretty soon nobody's going to trust you and it's not going to work, but you don't take advantage of other people, but you also don't sacrifice. You don't sacrifice to other people. You have the right to your own life, and including in choosing to help people that you want to help. In our business, we try to help our clients achieve economic success and financial security. We expect to make a profit doing it. We get better together. And the trader principle is really about recognizing that life is about creating win-win relationships. And that's how markets work, and that was the idea of the United States. Let's get better together through creating win-win relationships. My favorite book was written by Ayn Rand in 1957. It's called Atlas Shrugged. If you haven't read it, you ought to read it. If you haven't read it recently, you ought to read it. She wrote the book so that what she was predicting wouldn't happen. Unfortunately, 50 years later, it's happened. If you want to hear the villains that were 50 years ago that are today in Wall Street, they're right in this book. You ought to read this book. Where do we go from now? We're in a serious recession. We're not going to have a global meltdown like the Depression of the 30s is not a good analogy. We won't make those same set of mistakes. But what we have done is interesting to me. I think we will have a modest recovery. We have a very resilient system, and a lot of these incentives will work in the short term. Here's the dilemma. The odds are very high that we set ourselves up for a lower real growth rate for an almost indefinite period of time. The most likely scenario is not guaranteed stagflation, like the 1970s. And that looks like some real growth, higher inflation, higher unemployment than the natural market rate would be. Lower than today, but a higher market rate. If you look at the policies being proposed today, they look like Jimmy Carter. I mean, you can almost line them up and say, this is Jimmy Carter came back. Now, those of you that are in my age group, remember the 70s was not fun. It was not terrible, but it was not fun. Reagan was a hero, not for the kind of things we talk about today, but because he basically broke stagflation. That's what made him The long term really concerns me. It really concerns me. It ought to concern everybody in this room. We are potentially really headed in the wrong direction. If we continue with altruism, pragmatism, free lunch mentality, we have the forces in place to create an economic disaster in the long term. We have massive deficits in Social Security, huge deficits in Medicare and Medicaid that we're getting ready to make a lot worse. We're operating with a $1.4 trillion annual deficit and no real plan to how we get that back under control. We've got a failed foreign policy. We've got a big demographic problem with the baby boomers that gets worse. We've got a failed K-12 education system by any kind of objective standard. We've got some real challenges. In fact, it reminds me a lot of the time, a story I told you about being on the committee looking at Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. We ran the numbers, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were going broke for certain. You can run the numbers on the United States, and in 25 years, the United States goes broke. Now, the way countries go broke, they don't file bankruptcy. They print money, have hyperinflation, they go to a third world country like Argentina. If we continue the current trends, we will be a third world country in 25 years. It's a mathematical certainty. We're already hearing noise about that. The Chinese are already figuring out what to do when the U.S. fails in a certain sense because of the policies that we have. We're headed towards a third world country. Interesting. There's something we can do about it, but it's the opposite of what we're doing. We've got to return to the principles that got us here in the first place. Individual rights, free markets, rewards for innovation, rewards for productivity. We need less regulation, not more. Every time the government screws things up, we get more government. It's an interesting process. Mess them up and get more government. Interesting process. There is some good news, and I call it the American sense of life. Americans are naturally entrepreneurial people. They don't like big government. We're seeing some kickback around that. It's kind of protected us through the process, and I think it's good news. I think the American sense of life is a